Lieutenant Commander John Harley pressed his body flat against the spray-drenched deck of PT-59, his knuckles white around the cold steel railing. Through the suffocating darkness of the Solomon Islands night, he could see nothing, only hear the monstrous rumble of Japanese destroyers somewhere in the obsidian waters ahead. The date was August 1, 1943, and what happened in the next 60 seconds would either save 400 trapped Marines or condemn them to death. "Cut engines," he whispered into the speaking tube. The 3 Packard V-12 engines fell silent, their thunderous 1,500 horsepower reduced to a predatory whisper. For a moment, the only sound was water lapping against the plywood hull. Then came the noise that haunted every PT boat sailor's nightmares. The deep, mechanical groan of Japanese steel cutting through the Pacific. The enemy was close, too close. This was the terrible beauty of PT boat warfare. 78 feet of wood and gasoline, carrying more explosives than a small destroyer, hunting ships 10 times their size in waters controlled by the enemy. The Japanese called them Maboroshi, ghosts. They appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating fury, and vanished before the night could give up their secrets. But how did these fragile vessels of plywood and hope become one of World War II's most feared weapons? How did American ingenuity transform what the Navy initially dismissed as toys into the terror of the Pacific? The answer lies in desperation, innovation, and a generation of young men who refused to accept that David couldn't beat Goliath. If David was fast enough, clever enough, and brave enough to strike from the shadows. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America's PT boat fleet was pitifully small, just a handful of boats scattered across the Pacific. Within months, that would change, but not fast enough to stop the Japanese juggernaut. PT boats were in the Philippines when war came. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, commanded by Lieutenant John Bulkeley, found themselves in the middle of a nightmare. The Japanese invasion was overwhelming. American and Filipino forces were being pushed back across the archipelago, fighting desperate rearguard actions against an enemy that controlled the sea and sky. Bulkeley and his 6 PT boats became something unexpected, heroes in a catastrophe. While battleships burned at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines fell piece by bloody piece, these little boats fought back. They attacked Japanese invasion convoys, ambushed cruisers in Manila Bay, and rescued stranded soldiers from beaches overrun by the enemy. On January 18, 1942, PT-34 scored the first confirmed kill, a 5,000-ton Japanese supply ship sent to the bottom in Subic Bay. The celebration was brief. For every victory, there were a dozen brushes with death. PT boats hunted in waters where Japanese warships prowled like sharks, and a single hit from a destroyer's 5-inch gun could disintegrate a PT boat like a matchstick in a hurricane. But their most famous mission came in March 1942. General Douglas MacArthur, America's supreme commander in the Philippines, was trapped on the fortress island of Corregidor. Japan wanted him dead or captured. President Roosevelt wanted him alive. The only way out was across 70 miles of enemy-controlled waters, past Japanese patrol boats, destroyers, and aircraft that hunted anything that moved. For PT boats, PT-34, PT-35, PT-41, and PT-32 prepared for the impossible mission. Each boat carried evacuees. MacArthur, his family, his staff, and nurses fleeing before the inevitable fall of the Philippines. Lieutenant Bulkeley commanded from PT-41. The night of March 11th was darker than death itself. The boats scattered to confuse any pursuers, each taking a different route through the Japanese blockade. Waves towered over the small craft, engines screamed at full throttle, and every shadow might hide a destroyer. PT-41, carrying MacArthur, was spotted by a Japanese cruiser. Searchlights stabbed across the water. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the beam swept toward them. Bulkeley spun the wheel hard, diving into the darkness between the waves. The searchlight passed by, the cruiser moving on, hunting for prey it couldn't quite find. 35 hours later, battered and running on fumes, the PT boats reached Mindanao. MacArthur stepped ashore and made his famous promise, "I shall return." The PT boats had done the impossible. Lieutenant Bulkeley received the Medal of Honor. But more importantly, PT boats were no longer toys. They were proven warriors. ## the tactical revolution, how to kill giants. By late 1942, American industry was producing PT boats by the dozens. Squadrons deployed to every theater, the South Pacific, the Mediterranean, the English Channel. But building boats was the easy part. Learning how to use them effectively was written in blood and hard-won experience. The fundamental problem was this: PT boats carried Mark 8 torpedoes, weapons designed to sink battleships and carriers. But torpedoes were temperamental beasts. They ran too deep or too shallow. They failed to explode. They broached, breaking the surface and leaving a wake that pointed straight back to the launching boat like an arrow saying, "Shoot here." Early in the war, PT boats fired dozens of torpedoes with heartbreakingly few hits. The Japanese, meanwhile, were learning to fear these ghost boats. After-action reports from Japanese commanders reveal a pattern of confusion and terror. Destroyers would report being attacked by submarines, only to see their torpedoes coming from the surface. Patrol boats would fire at radar contacts that vanished like smoke. Supply convoys began requesting destroyer escorts even in waters previously considered safe. The psychological impact was enormous. PT boats forced the Japanese to divert resources, destroyers, patrol boats, aircraft, to hunt an enemy that struck in darkness and disappeared before dawn. They made coastal waters contested territory, forcing Japanese ships to travel in heavily defended convoys or risk the night runs that could end in sudden, violent death. PT boat commanders developed new tactics through brutal trial and error. They learned to approach targets with engines at idle, drifting in on the current until they were close enough to guarantee a hit. They learned to fire torpedoes in pairs or salvos, creating a spread that even a maneuvering target couldn't evade. They learned that the best time to attack was during the darkest phase of the moon, when even the keenest Japanese lookout couldn't see a low-slung wooden boat against the black water. They also learned that torpedoes weren't their only weapon. PT boats bristled with machine guns, .50 caliber Brownings that could shred aircraft and light vessels. Some crews mounted 37mm or even 40mm cannon. Depth charges could be dropped or rolled off the stern. In the desperate close-quarters battles of the Solomon Islands, PT boats became improvised gunboats, slugging it out with Japanese barges and patrol craft at ranges so close that sailors on both sides could see each other's faces in the muzzle flashes. The boats themselves evolved. Early models were cramped, wet, and unreliable. By 1943, PT boats featured improved hulls, better engines, and sophisticated radar, first search radar, then fire control systems that let them hunt in conditions where human eyes were useless. Some boats carried smoke generators that could lay a protective screen in seconds. Others mounted experimental weapons, rockets, recoilless rifles, even flamethrowers for close-in work against fortified positions. But the most important innovation was tactical flexibility. PT boats hunted in wolf packs, coordinating attacks from multiple directions. They used radio discipline and coded signals to confuse Japanese radio intelligence. They established forward bases on tiny islands, operating from hidden coves where mechanics worked by lamplight to keep engines running and torpedo men carefully nursed their precious fish back to readiness. On the night of August 1st to 2nd, 1943, 15 PT boats set out from their base in the Russell Islands. Their mission: intercept the Tokyo Express, the nickname for Japanese destroyer runs down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands where Japanese warships raced at night to resupply and reinforce their garrison on Kalimbangara. PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, was one of those boats. Kennedy was 26 years old, from a wealthy Massachusetts family, more comfortable in a Harvard classroom than a combat zone. But PT boats didn't care about pedigree. They cared about courage and competence, and on this night, Kennedy would need both. The night was impossibly dark. Cloud cover obscured the stars, and without moonlight, the water was like black glass. PT boats patrolled on barely idling engines, listening for the distinctive sound of Japanese destroyers pushing through at high speed. At 2:30 a.m., PT-109's crew heard it, the growing thunder of a ship approaching fast. Too fast. Kennedy ordered engines to start, but before they could roar to life, a massive shape materialized out of the darkness. The destroyer Amagiri, racing at nearly 30 knots, was suddenly there, a steel cliff rising from the water. There was no time to maneuver, no time to fire torpedoes, no time to do anything but brace. Amagiri's bow struck PT-109 amidships with a sickening crunch of splintering wood. The impact sliced the PT boat nearly in half. 2 crew members in the stern section died instantly, vaporized in the explosion as 3,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel ignited. The forward section, miraculously, stayed afloat. Kennedy was thrown across the cockpit, slamming into the opposite bulkhead so hard he injured his back. Around him, men were in the water, screaming, burning fuel, turning patches of ocean into hellfire. The destroyer disappeared into the darkness, its captain possibly unaware he just rammed an American PT boat. For the next 15 hours, Kennedy and his surviving crew clung to the floating wreckage. When dawn came and it was clear no rescue was coming, the other PT boats assumed PT-109 had been destroyed with all hands. Kennedy made a decision. They would swim for a small island visible 3 miles away. Kennedy, a former Harvard swim team member, took the most severely injured man, Patrick McMahon, a badly burned engineer, and towed him the entire distance by clenching the strap of McMahon's life jacket between his teeth and swimming breaststroke. Took 5 hours. The other survivors followed, pushing a timber from the wreckage that they clung to like a life raft. They reached the island, little more than a spit of sand and palm trees, and collapsed. But they were in Japanese-controlled waters, miles from friendly forces, with no food, no water, and no radio. Kennedy knew that if they stayed, they would die of thirst or be captured. For the next 6 days, Kennedy led his crew on a desperate island-hopping journey, searching for food, water, and a way to signal friendly forces. He swam into open ocean at night, hoping to flag down passing PT boats. He carved messages on coconuts, hoping native islanders would carry them to Australian coast watchers. He kept his crew together when every logical reason said they should give up. On August 8th, 2 native Solomon Islanders in a canoe found them. They carried Kennedy's coconut message, Noro ISL, Commander, native knows Poasiti. He can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat, Kennedy, to Australian coast watcher Reginald Evans. That night, PT boats came. Kennedy and his crew were saved. The incident made Kennedy a hero. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his leadership and courage. But it also revealed the terrible vulnerability of PT boats. Amagiri hadn't even been trying to ram them. It was simply passing through at high speed. If a destroyer could accidentally destroy a PT boat that easily, what happened when they hunted intentionally? The answer was, PT boats learned to be even more careful, more cunning, more willing to strike from the shadows and vanish before the enemy could respond. The Solomon Islands campaign from 1942 to 1944 was PT boat warfare at its most intense. The strategic situation was brutally simple. Japanese forces held the northern islands, Americans held the southern, and between them lay hundreds of miles of contested water where every night became a deadly game of hide-and-seek. The Japanese needed to resupply and reinforce their garrisons. American air power made daylight travel suicidal, so the Japanese ran the Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs at night, racing down the slot at 30 knots, dropping off supplies and troops, then racing back before dawn. They were fast, heavily armed, and led by some of the best destroyer captains in the world. PT boats became the primary American counter. Operating from forward bases at Rendova, Lever Harbor, and Tulagi, they patrolled every night, hunting for the Express. It was a mismatch on paper, wooden boats against steel destroyers, but the PT boats had advantages. They were small, maneuverable, and could hide in the island shadows. They had radar when Japanese destroyers often didn't. And most importantly, they were expendable in a way destroyers weren't. The Navy could lose a PT boat and her crew would be mourned. Lose a destroyer and hundreds of men died. The tactics evolved into a deadly dance. PT boats would set up patrol lines across likely approach routes. When radar detected incoming ships, they would vector multiple boats toward the contact. The attack would come from multiple directions simultaneously, some boats firing torpedoes from maximum range, others charging in close with guns blazing, all trying to create enough confusion that the torpedoes could reach their targets before the destroyers could maneuver. It rarely went according to plan. Japanese destroyers were commanded by veterans who'd spent years perfecting night combat. They had excellent optics, night binoculars that could spot a PT boat's wake in starlight. They had searchlights powerful enough to blind PT boat crews from a mile away. And they had guns, 5-inch main batteries, 25mm machine cannons, torpedoes of their own, that could obliterate a PT boat if the range closed. On the night of October 6, 1943, PT boats fought one of their most savage battles. 9 boats intercepted a reinforcement convoy off Vella La Vella. 9 Japanese destroyers and destroyer transports. The odds were absurd, 9 PT boats against 9 destroyers in restricted waters where maneuverability advantages disappeared. The battle devolved into chaos. PT boats fired torpedoes and wheeled away. Japanese destroyers responded with gunfire that turned the night into flickering hell. Searchlights stabbed through darkness, machine guns hammered, and explosions walked across the water. PT-168 was bracketed by destroyer fire and limped away streaming fuel and smoke. PT-159 tangled with a destroyer at point-blank range, both vessels firing everything they had. When dawn came, the butcher's bill was mixed. PT boats had damaged several destroyers and disrupted the landing. But 3 PT boats were heavily damaged, multiple crew members were dead or wounded, and the Japanese convoy had still managed to land most of their troops. It was victory and defeat wrapped together. A reminder that PT boat warfare was never easy, never clean, and never certain. Yet the cumulative effect was devastating. Japanese commanders grew increasingly reluctant to risk destroyers on supply runs. Convoys required heavier and heavier escorts. The Tokyo Express grew irregular, then rare, then stopped entirely. Not because PT boats had destroyed the Japanese fleet, they hadn't, but because they'd made the cost too high. While the Pacific claimed most of the glory, PT boats fought with equal ferocity in the Mediterranean. Squadron 15, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Stanley Barnes, arrived in North Africa in early 1943 and immediately began hunting in waters that had been controlled by German and Italian naval forces. The Mediterranean presented different challenges. The weather was rougher. The enemy had shore-based radar, artillery, and searchlight batteries that turned coastal waters into killing grounds. And the targets were different, not just destroyers, but heavily armed escort vessels called F-lighters and R-boats that the Germans used for coastal convoys. PT boats adapted. They raided harbors at night, sneaking past shore defenses to torpedo ships at anchor. They ambushed coastal convoys, appearing from behind headlands to fire and flee before the escorts could respond. They carried British and American commandos on raids against German installations, dropping them on enemy beaches and returning to extract them after the mission. One of the most audacious operations came in April 1944, when PT boats infiltrated the heavily defended Gulf of Gaeta near Anzio. German shore batteries ringed the Gulf, searchlights could illuminate the entire expanse of water, and German patrol boats hunted constantly. But intelligence indicated that several German escort ships were sheltering in the harbor, and Naval Command wanted them destroyed. 6 PT boats, led by Lieutenant Clifford Shanklin in PT-216, made the run. They entered the Gulf at midnight, engines barely whispering, navigating by radar and dead reckoning. Shore batteries swept the water with searchlights, but the PT boats stayed low, hugging the coastline where their wooden hulls blended into the rocky shore. At 1:30 a.m., they spotted the targets. 3 escort ships moored alongside a pier. Shanklin ordered the attack. PT boats surged forward, engines roaring to full power. Torpedoes launched, Mark 8s streaking toward the targets at 40 knots. Machine guns opened fire, not at the ships but at the shore batteries, trying to blind searchlight operators and suppress return fire. 2 torpedoes hit. 1 escort ship exploded, the blast so powerful it shattered windows in the town 2 miles away. The second ship broke in half and sank within minutes. The third escaped, but the mission was a success. PT boats had penetrated what the Germans considered an impregnable harbor and destroyed targets under their guns. But the Mediterranean proved costly. PT-202 was caught by shore fire off the Anzio beachhead, hit by an 88mm artillery shell that killed 4 men. PT-371 was sunk by a German fighter bomber. PT boats began carrying more armor, more guns, and more sophisticated electronic countermeasures. The boats grew heavier, slower, less like their original nimble selves. But they survived. Behind every PT boat mission were young men who lived with fear, exhaustion, and the constant knowledge that their next patrol might be their last. PT boat crews formed bonds that went beyond ordinary military camaraderie. When you lived in a space smaller than most bedrooms, shared meals heated on a single-burner stove, and depended on each other to survive encounters with enemies that could vaporize your boat with a single hit, you became family. The officers were often privileged sons. Kennedy was far from the only Ivy League graduate in PT boat ranks, but the war was a great equalizer. A lieutenant from Harvard might be saved by a motor machinist from Alabama who could keep 3 temperamental Packard engines running with baling wire and profanity. A torpedo man from Brooklyn might guide a college professor's son through the complexities of arming a Mark 8 torpedo without blowing them all to kingdom come. They developed their own culture, distinct from the rest of the Navy. PT boat bases were informal places where saluting was rare and rank mattered less than competence. Officers and enlisted men ate together, worked together, and went into combat together in a way that shocked visiting admirals used to the rigid hierarchies of capital ships. They also suffered unique stresses. PT boat combat happened at night, in darkness so complete that men couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The boats were loud, engines that could wake the dead when at full throttle. They were wet, tropical seas breaking over the bow, soaking everyone on deck. They stank of gasoline, sweat, and fear, and they were always in enemy territory. Many PT boat sailors developed what would later be called PTSD. The constant stress of night patrols, the sudden violence of combat, the loss of friends to accidents and enemy action, it ground men down. Some requested transfers. Some broke down entirely. Most simply endured, because that's what war demanded. But they also experienced moments of brotherhood, purpose, and even dark humor that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They gave their boats nicknames: Sudden Jerk, Bambi, Rusty, Little Butch. They painted nose art, pin-up girls, cartoon characters, skulls, and crossbones. They celebrated birthdays and holidays in waters where Japanese destroyers hunted every night. They found ways to laugh at the absurdity of riding plywood boats into combat against steel warships. After the war, many PT boat veterans struggled to explain to civilians what it had been like. How could you describe the sensation of going from complete darkness to blinding searchlight in a heartbeat? The sound of a torpedo hitting. Not the Hollywood explosion, but the duller crump of shaped charges detonating against a ship's hull? The mixture of exhilaration and terror when your boat was doing 40 knots in total darkness, trusting instruments and the commander's instincts to keep you from running aground? You couldn't. So they found each other instead. PT boat reunions became annual events. Old crew members who hadn't spoken in decades would reconnect, sharing stories that made sense only to men who'd ridden the ghosts. By 1944, the war had turned decisively against Japan. American industrial might was producing ships, aircraft, and weapons at a rate the Japanese couldn't match. The island-hopping campaign was pushing relentlessly toward the Japanese home islands. PT boats remained crucial, but their role was evolving. When MacArthur made good on his promise to return to the Philippines in October 1944, PT boats were there. They performed reconnaissance, marking invasion beaches and reporting on Japanese defenses. They rescued downed pilots. More than 500 Allied airmen owed their lives to PT boat crews who plucked them from enemy waters. They conducted guerrilla warfare, supplying Filipino resistance fighters and evacuating refugees. The Philippines campaign saw PT boats fight in rivers and coastal shallows, places too confined for larger warships. They supported army landings, providing close fire support when soldiers came under enemy fire. They hunted Japanese supply barges, small craft that couldn't survive daylight but still tried to supply cut-off garrisons at night. As the war moved closer to Japan itself, PT boats prepared for the ultimate mission: the invasion of the Japanese home islands. New tactics were developed. Boats were modified to carry rockets for shore bombardment. Crews trained for kamikaze defense. The grim knowledge that Japanese suicide planes would target anything afloat during an invasion. But the invasion never came. On August 6 and 9, 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. PT boats had served in every theater. They'd launched over 1,000 combat patrols. They'd fired thousands of torpedoes, rescued hundreds of survivors, and terrorized an enemy that controlled the seas. Of the 531 points boats built during the war, 69 were lost to enemy action, accidents, and weather. Hundreds of men died aboard them. After the war, analysts tried to determine how effective PT boats had actually been. The results were controversial. PT boats had fired hundreds of torpedoes but had relatively few confirmed sinkings, maybe 30 Japanese vessels destroyed by torpedo hits. From a purely statistical standpoint, they weren't efficient killers. But that analysis missed the point. PT boats' real impact wasn't measured in ships sunk but in strategic effect. They forced Japan to divert resources, destroyers, aircraft, patrol boats, to defend against an enemy that cost America relatively little to build and crew. They made Japanese coastal waters contested territory, forcing convoys to travel with heavy escorts or risk the night runs. They disrupted supply lines, forcing Japan to use larger, faster ships when smaller vessels would have been more efficient. Most importantly, they proved that unconventional warfare could work. PT boats were the spiritual ancestors of later fast attack craft, missile boats, and special operations forces. They demonstrated that speed, stealth, and surprise could overcome raw firepower. They showed that well-led small units could punch far above their weight. The Japanese never solved the PT boat problem. They tried everything. Improved radar, more patrol boats, air patrols, minefields, shore batteries. Nothing worked consistently. The ghosts kept coming, night after night, appearing from darkness, striking, and vanishing before dawn. When the war ended, PT boats disappeared almost overnight. They were built for combat, not for peacetime. Their wooden hulls rotted in tropical climates. Their engines, pushed to maximum power night after night, were worn out. Most were scrapped or scuttled. A few became tourist attractions or floating museums. PT-109's wreck was never recovered, lying somewhere on the bottom of Blackett Strait. The men who crewed them went home. Some became famous. John F. Kennedy rode his PT-109 experience all the way to the presidency. Most simply returned to ordinary lives. Farmers, teachers, businessmen, fathers. They'd been tested in ways most people never would be, and they'd passed that test. But the spirit of PT boat warfare lived on. In Vietnam, American patrol boats called swift boats used similar tactics to interdict enemy supply lines. Modern navies worldwide deploy fast attack craft armed with missiles and torpedoes. Special operations forces use stealth and surprise to attack targets that conventional forces can't reach. All of them owe something to those young men who climbed aboard plywood boats and rode them into darkness against an enemy that should have destroyed them. The Japanese were right to be stunned. PT boats weren't supposed to work. They were too small, too fragile, too lightly armed. But they had what mattered most. Crews who refused to accept limitations, commanders who thought creatively, and a willingness to strike from the shadows rather than face the enemy in open combat where they'd be destroyed. They were ghosts. Maboroshi*, appearing when least expected, striking with devastating fury, and vanishing before retaliation could come. And for 4 years of brutal warfare across 2 oceans, those ghosts terrified the most powerful naval forces in the world. That's the secret America's PT boats taught the world. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it's the one your enemy never sees coming. The strike from the shadows that turns their strength into vulnerability. Sometimes David beats Goliath not by standing and fighting, but by striking from darkness and disappearing before Goliath can lift his sword. The PT boats are gone now, rotted away or rusting in museums. But their legacy remains. Audacity can defeat size, Courage can overcome firepower, and sometimes the most effective weapon is the ghost that haunts your enemy's nightmares. Lieutenant Commander Harley and the trapped Marines on Vela La Vela? They made it out. PT-59 and he